February 11th, 1945. Winston Churchill sat in the Levadia Palace in Yalta, signing agreements that would seal the fate of millions of Poles who had fought beside Britain for 6 long years. The man who had declared, "We shall never surrender," was surrendering Poland to Soviet domination, abandoning the very nation whose defense had brought Britain into World War II. Across the table, Joseph Stalin smiled as he secured everything he had demanded: Soviet control over Eastern Europe, recognition of his puppet Polish government, and Western acceptance of territorial annexations that violated every principle Britain had claimed to fight for. What Churchill told himself was diplomatic necessity was actually strategic betrayal. The Prime Minister, who had promised to restore Polish independence, was instead delivering Poland into a slavery that would last 44 years, creating the division of Europe that would define the Cold War. The decision to abandon Poland would make Stalin's empire possible, split the world into hostile camps, and prove that Britain's war aims had been sacrificed to political expedience when victory seemed more important than the principles that had justified the struggle. This is the story of how Churchill abandoned Poland and started the Cold War, how moral promises became political bargaining chips, and how the Prime Minister who saved Western freedom destroyed Eastern freedom to secure his place at the victor's table. The betrayal began 5 years earlier, when Churchill made promises to Poland that he never intended to keep. September 3, 1939. Britain declared war on Germany following Hitler's invasion of Poland, with Churchill's voice broadcasting to the nation: "We have resolved to finish Hitler and Nazism once and for all. This decision has been taken for the sake of Poland, a country we are pledged to defend." The declaration established Poland as the moral centerpiece of Britain's war effort. British propaganda emphasized that the war was being fought to restore Polish independence and ensure that small nations could live free from foreign domination. Poland became the symbol of everything Britain claimed to represent. But Churchill's private communications revealed different priorities. Even as he made public promises about Polish restoration, he was already considering territorial concessions that would satisfy Soviet demands. The Polish cause was useful for mobilizing British public opinion, but Soviet cooperation was essential for defeating Germany. The contradiction between public promises and private calculations would define Churchill's entire approach to the Polish question. He would use Polish sacrifice to justify British policy, while preparing to sacrifice Polish interests for British advantage. December 1941. Soviet entry into the war following German invasion transformed the strategic situation completely. Stalin became Britain's essential ally, providing the manpower necessary to defeat Germany on the Eastern Front. Churchill recognized immediately that Soviet cooperation was more valuable than Polish independence. The shift in priorities was subtle but decisive. Churchill began speaking about the need for realistic solutions to the Polish question that would accommodate Soviet security interests. Polish independence remained a stated British objective, but Soviet satisfaction became the practical requirement for any post-war settlement. Stalin made his demands clear from the beginning: Soviet annexation of Eastern Poland, installation of a communist government in Warsaw, and Western recognition of Soviet hegemony over Eastern Europe. Churchill understood that refusing these demands would risk Soviet withdrawal from the anti-German alliance. The choice between Polish freedom and Soviet alliance was never really a choice for Churchill. He had decided that defeating Germany required accepting Stalin's terms, regardless of what those terms meant for Polish independence. January 1943. The discovery of the Katyn Forest massacre revealed the true nature of Soviet intentions toward Poland. Evidence showed that Stalin had ordered the execution of 22,000 Polish officers, intellectuals, and military leaders, the very people who would have led an independent Poland after the war. Churchill's response to Katyn demonstrated how completely British policy had subordinated Polish interests to Soviet alliance. Despite overwhelming evidence of Soviet guilt, Churchill suppressed information about the massacre and supported Soviet claims that Germany was responsible for the atrocity. The cover-up required active cooperation in Soviet propaganda that Churchill knew to be false. British intelligence confirmed Soviet responsibility for Katyn, but Churchill chose to preserve the alliance by participating in lies that blamed Germany for Soviet crimes. The decision revealed that Churchill had already chosen Stalin over Poland. The Prime Minister, who claimed to fight for truth and freedom, was willing to suppress truth and enable Stalin's elimination of Polish leadership if doing so served British strategic interests. November 1943. The Tehran Conference established the framework for Poland's destruction while maintaining the fiction of Allied unity. Churchill agreed to Soviet annexation of eastern Poland and accepted Stalin's demand for a friendly Polish government, understanding that both concessions meant the end of genuine Polish independence. Churchill's justification for the Tehran agreements revealed how completely he had abandoned the principles that had brought Britain into the war. He argued that Soviet demands were reasonable given their security needs, and that Poland would benefit from Soviet protection against future German aggression. The rationalization ignored the obvious reality that Soviet protection meant Soviet domination. Churchill was intelligent enough to understand the implications of his agreements, but politically committed to alliance with Stalin, regardless of the consequences for Poland. Stalin's satisfaction with the Tehran results demonstrated that Churchill had given him everything he wanted. The Soviet leader had secured Western recognition of his right to control Eastern Europe without making any meaningful concessions about the nature of that control. August 1944. The Warsaw Uprising exposed the full moral bankruptcy of Churchill's Polish policy. As Polish resistance fighters battled German occupation forces, Stalin deliberately halted Soviet advance and refused to allow Western aid to reach the insurgents, ensuring that Germany would eliminate Poland's potential post-war leadership. Churchill's response to the Warsaw tragedy revealed his complete subordination to Soviet policy. Despite desperate Polish appeals for assistance, Churchill refused to challenge Stalin's decision to let the uprising fail. British policy supported Soviet strategy even when that strategy involved allowing Polish patriots to die. The abandonment of Warsaw demonstrated that Churchill's promises about restoring Polish independence had been empty rhetoric. When Polish fighters needed British support most desperately, Churchill chose to preserve his relationship with Stalin rather than honor his commitments to Poland. The message to Poles was clear. British promises were worthless when Soviet interests were at stake. Churchill had chosen his alliance with Stalin over his obligations to the nation, whose defense had supposedly justified the entire war. February 1945. At Yalta, Churchill completed Poland's betrayal by formally recognizing the Soviet puppet government and accepting territorial changes that eliminated Poland as an independent state. The agreements gave Stalin everything he had demanded while providing Poland with nothing except empty promises about free elections that everyone knew would never be honored. Churchill's behavior at Yalta revealed how thoroughly he had internalized Soviet priorities. He argued Stalin's case more effectively than Stalin himself, convincing Roosevelt that Soviet demands were reasonable and that Polish objections were unrealistic given post-war political realities. The Prime Minister, who had once promised to restore Polish independence, now dismissed Polish concerns as obstacles to great power cooperation. Churchill had become Stalin's advocate in negotiations that determined Poland's fate without meaningful Polish participation. Roosevelt's illness and exhaustion made Churchill the dominant Western voice at Yalta, giving him primary responsibility for decisions that condemned Eastern Europe to decades of Soviet domination. Churchill used his influence to facilitate Soviet expansion rather than resist it. March 1945. The immediate aftermath of Yalta demonstrated that Churchill's promises about Polish autonomy under Soviet influence had been deliberately deceptive. Stalin moved quickly to eliminate remaining Polish independence leaders and consolidate communist control over all aspects of Polish political life. Churchill's response to Stalin's violations of Yalta agreements revealed that he had never expected those agreements to protect Polish interests. When Stalin arrested Polish leaders who had participated in negotiations under Allied guarantees, Churchill protested weakly, but took no meaningful action. The pattern established at Yalta continued throughout the final months of the war. Stalin violated agreements with impunity, while Churchill provided diplomatic cover by minimizing Soviet violations and emphasizing the need for continued Allied cooperation. British policy had become indistinguishable from Soviet policy on all matters relating to Eastern Europe. Churchill had transformed Britain from Poland's protector into Poland's betrayer, facilitating Soviet domination while maintaining the fiction of Allied unity. April 1945. Roosevelt's death elevated Harry Truman to the American presidency, creating an opportunity for Churchill to reconsider his Polish policy before Soviet control became irreversible. Truman was initially skeptical of Soviet intentions and open to a harder line against Stalin's violations of Yalta agreements. But Churchill used his influence with Truman to discourage American resistance to Soviet expansion. The Prime Minister argued that confronting Stalin over Poland would risk destroying the alliance needed to complete Germany's defeat and manage the post-war world. Churchill's advice to Truman represented the complete abandonment of the principles that had supposedly motivated British entry into the war. The man who had fought against German domination of Poland was now arguing against American resistance to Soviet domination of Poland. The transformation was morally and strategically disastrous. Churchill was teaching Truman to accept Soviet expansion as inevitable, creating the foundation for Cold War division of Europe that Churchill himself would later claim to oppose. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe was celebrated in London, while Polish soldiers who had fought for Britain faced the reality that their homeland had been sacrificed to secure that victory. The men who had defended British skies in the Battle of Britain were now stateless persons, unable to return to a Poland controlled by Britain's Soviet allies. Churchill's Victory Day speeches emphasized the restoration of freedom to Western Europe, while ignoring the destruction of freedom in Eastern Europe that his policies had enabled. The moral contradiction was stark. Britain had fought to preserve its own independence while destroying the independence of its most loyal ally. The celebration of victory masked the reality that Britain's war aims had been completely abandoned. The war that had begun with promises to restore Polish independence ended with acceptance of Polish subjugation under a different totalitarian regime. Churchill had won the war by betraying the principles that had supposedly justified fighting it. Victory had been achieved through moral compromise that made victory meaningless for the nation, whose defense had motivated Britain's initial involvement. July 1945. The Potsdam Conference completed Poland's dismemberment as Churchill, now leading a caretaker government after electoral defeat, finalized territorial arrangements that eliminated Poland as a meaningful, independent state. The borders agreed at Potsdam created a Poland that was geographically and politically a Soviet satellite. Churchill's final negotiations over Poland demonstrated his complete acceptance of Soviet domination. He argued for minor adjustments to territorial boundaries while accepting the fundamental reality of Soviet control over Polish political life. The Polish government in exile, which had operated from London throughout the war, was abandoned completely as Churchill recognized Stalin's puppet regime as the legitimate representative of the Polish people. 6 years of Polish loyalty to Britain was rewarded with British recognition of Poland's destroyers. The men who had fought beside Britain since 1939 were told they could not return home safely because the Poland they had fought to restore no longer existed. Churchill had created a victory that was indistinguishable from defeat for Britain's most steadfast ally. 1946-1989. The consequences of Churchill's Polish betrayal shaped the next 4 decades of European history. Poland disappeared behind the Iron Curtain that Churchill himself would later famously describe, subjected to communist dictatorship that was the direct result of his wartime decisions. The division of Europe that Churchill had enabled at Yalta and Potsdam created the Cold War confrontation that dominated international relations until 1989. The world was split between democratic and totalitarian camps because Churchill had chosen to accommodate totalitarian expansion rather than resist it. Polish resistance to Soviet domination continued for decades, from the 1956 uprising through Solidarity in 1980. But these efforts were hampered by the international recognition that Churchill had given to Soviet control. Britain's wartime ally became Soviet Union's unwilling satellite. The irony was complete. Churchill, who would become famous as the prophet of Soviet threat, had created the conditions that made Soviet threat possible by abandoning the principles necessary to resist Soviet expansion when resistance might have been effective. Polish independence was finally restored when the communist system collapsed, ending 44 years of foreign domination that had begun with Churchill's wartime decisions. The restoration vindicated Polish resistance to Soviet rule and revealed the moral bankruptcy of the accommodations Churchill had made. The peaceful Polish Revolution of 1989 demonstrated that the principles Churchill had abandoned in 1945, national self-determination, democratic governance, and resistance to foreign domination, remained powerful enough to ultimately overcome the totalitarian system he had helped create. The lesson was clear but uncomfortable. Churchill's realistic diplomacy had been less realistic than Polish unrealistic insistence on independence. The Poles who had refused to accept Soviet domination had been proven right about the possibility of freedom, while Churchill had been proven wrong about the necessity of accommodation. The Cold War's end revealed that the betrayal of Poland had been unnecessary as well as immoral. Soviet control over Eastern Europe had not been inevitable, but had resulted from Western decisions to accept Soviet demands rather than resist Soviet expansion when resistance was still possible. Post-war analysis confirmed that Churchill's abandonment of Poland had been the foundational decision that created the Cold War world. By choosing alliance with Stalin over solidarity with Poland, Churchill had enabled Soviet expansion that made confrontation inevitable once Soviet intentions became undeniable. The Prime Minister who saved Western freedom had destroyed Eastern freedom to secure victory that could have been achieved without moral compromise. Churchill's greatness was diminished by his willingness to sacrifice principle for expedience, when principle was what the war had supposedly been fought to defend. The betrayal of Poland proved that even the greatest leaders could be corrupted by the logic of total war that made any compromise acceptable if it promised military victory. Churchill had chosen to win the war at the cost of losing the peace for millions of people who had trusted Britain to honor its commitments. In the end, the man who had declared, "We shall never surrender," had surrendered the moral foundation of British policy, trading the principles that justified the war for the alliance that won the war. Poland's freedom had been the price of Churchill's victory, and the payment had made victory hollow for both Britain and the nation it had pledged to defend. The abandonment of Poland had started the Cold War by teaching Stalin that Western democracies would accept totalitarian expansion if the alternative was confrontation. Churchill's moral failure had become the world's strategic disaster, proving that great men could make great mistakes that shaped history for generations.